All right, here we are. Underway again. Welcome to Barbour's Chapter 9. On the media is the topic of the day. I've got a few satirical, newsy type links mixed in, and then a couple links at the very end that will make your semester. And I hope to get us out of here in, I don't know, under 45 minutes or so, so we'll see. But anyway, uh, I've said this a time or two, and I try not to repeat myself needlessly, but I've been somewhat critical of this text from the outset, particularly in how I feel it kind of reads like a kid's book from time to time. But I do appreciate the way that the author, Christine Barbour, here talks about some um, serious issues in ways that I've never seen a intro to U.S. politics textbook do, and I do appreciate that. This theme that runs through the book on mediated citizenship is useful and very much does help us to better understand real life, the world around us, and this chapter on media is no exception. I like this notion of media babies. I'm not in love necessarily with the term, but I like the idea, right? You folks, as young as you are, most of you, I'm sure, um, grew up with technology, right? You are dependent on channels of communication. When my phone runs out of battery, I feel alive. When your phone runs out of battery, you probably want to cry. And you do everything in your power to prevent that from happening. I don't, right? And that's because, I'm over 40 years old and I didn't grow up with this stuff in my hand. But a consequence of the media reality that we all live in, whether I like it or not, I still live in it too, is we're surrounded by this media technology complex. You'll hear the word or the term military industrial complex here in a couple of weeks. But oftentimes in the context of US politics, when you hear complex at the end of a statement like this, it's a bit of a loaded term, but this is to say that we are surrounded by media. It is an abundant resource for us, whether we like it or not. And it's really just up to us as individuals with our functioning brainstems to decide how we're going to use media and how we're going to let it affect our lives. That's what we'll flesh out throughout the next 25 slides or so. So, where we get our information is important. Lots of different sources of information. At the broadest, we can use media aggregators. I'm not a fan of these, websites that tell you that they're going to, filter the news for you. There are some I see advertised now and again that talk about, presenting you news from the left, news from the right. The media aggregator I pick on the most that I really dislike is the Huffington Post. When it launched, I don't know, a decade and change ago, I would sometimes look at it and then realize that I was, the Huffington Post is a media aggregator par excellence. And I say that because you can read an article on the Huffington Post, or the Huff Post, I believe it's called now, and get to the end and realize, oh, what the author of this article, and I use the term author loosely, is doing is basically just regurgitating a news story from another source. And if you're like me, you just as soon go straight to the original source and get the information, right? So whether it's Reddit, whether it's even Facebook can be a media aggregator of sorts, the Huffington Post or the Huff Post, what have you. I avoid those. I'm smart enough to go find my own news, and I hope you are too. And I say Facebook in here as a media aggregator because Facebook definitely depends on algorithms. That are equations that in effect analyze you and your social media accounts and movements and such to then spit news out that the algorithm thinks you're going to like. And we'll come back to why that is problematic here in a few slides. But what really matters is the hard work that journalists and reporters do. This link here will take you to a John Oliver clip broadly on journalism, particularly on print journalism, particularly on local newspapers. And I realize the likelihood that any of you have actually purchased a newspaper in your life is slim to none. But your lives are shaped more than you realize by decisions made locally and that you know about them or what you know about them really boils down, again, to the hard work that local journalists do. So I would suggest, encourage you to hit the pause button and then watch this link here that's posted in Blackboard about print journalism and see what you think. See what priorities are today. And I promise it will make you laugh a little bit. I just showed this in class not too long ago and people did chuckle quite a bit. So, I mean, it's John Oliver. There's some objectionable jokes about the anatomy and such that I sometimes wish weren't there, but it's still kind of funny. I appreciate that Barbour deals with the issue of fake news. A certain former president made this very topical. But real journalism that's done by real reporters out in the field is meant to be the truth, right? And I realize with all the information, again, this abundant resource that surrounds us, it can be overwhelming at times to try to figure out what is real and what's not. But good journalism will include empirical evidence. And if you don't know what empirical means, a synonym might be observable. What the philosophical approach called empiricism deals with what is observable, right? What we can observe. And reporters report facts that they too can observe, and they share with us because we can't have our eyes fixed upon every point of the globe at the same time. So we need field reporters to tell us what the hell is going on. And of course, the notion of fake news, and this will come up again in the slides here, but the very notion of fake news is basically just a former president's way of saying, I don't like that news, and I'm not going to give it any credit. But anyway, when it comes to our media menu, how we get our information, again, we talk to each other, right? We can talk about how word of mouth can spread news. Print journalism is again, that thing that you probably never have interacted with very seriously. Broadcast news began as the big three networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, later including NPR and then the Fox channel, Fox network, not Fox News directly. But these were the original 5 really broadcast networks that existed. I mean, when I was growing up, when I was really younger, before we got cable, before it made it to my house in suburban Kansas City, Kansas, that was it. I had 5 channels to choose from when I turned on the TV on Saturday morning. And believe you me, it was not fun. And when cable arrived, it changed my life. But beyond that, when we speak of broadcast news, I guess we can include the cable news, and I'm using air quotes here, the cable news networks, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN tries. I think it tries so hard to be middle of the road that it's really bland. But anyway, that's the broadcast options we have. And then the electronic media outlets are, in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, not millions around the globe. Really, any blog could be considered an electronic media outlet. I wouldn't go that far. I take the word media outlet a little more seriously. But anyway, again, this is just to reiterate the fact that we are surrounded by information. So again, this is why I appreciate the fact that Barbour sticks with this theme throughout the text, the theme of this mediated citizenship, that we all live, right? We are surrounded by information and we have it literally flowing out of our pockets. But the flip side of this coin is that we are vulnerable to manipulation. This is, again, what the flip side of the coin I mentioned just a few minutes ago. We need to be aware of the fact that we need to pay attention. We can't just trust everything that comes out of the phone that's in our pocket, lest we find ourselves stuck inside of an information bubble, right? I strongly encourage you folks, however you lean politically, whatever you think you know politically, please don't find yourself in a bubble. If you are in a bubble, pop that bubble, right? Look at news that is from a different end of the political spectrum than where you might find yourself, right? I subscribe to my favorite magazine, The Economist, which it's printed in the UK, but they know a lot about the United States, and it's pretty conservative. I'm not necessarily, but I love that magazine. It's probably my most trusted news source. Beyond that, I like PBS NewsHour, which is very dry, does a very good job of being very neutral on everything to the point that it can be pretty boring. but I like it. It's informative. NPR, National Public Radio, is sort of the same. If you live in San Antonio, I encourage you to tune your radio dial to, I believe it's 89.1 is Texas Public Radio, the local affiliate of National Public Radio. And again, pretty middle of the road, at times pretty dry, at times extremely interesting, all the time extremely informative. And then I also subscribe to Foreign Affairs, which is a pretty conservative, hawkish almost, almost academic journal that again is pretty conservative. But I do look at other news sources, but I feel like I get a pretty good balance of the mainstream and a little to the right, and then I'll occasionally seek out something. Oh, I subscribe to The Atlantic too, which is a monthly magazine that definitely leans more to the left. So again, I try to balance my media diet, and exactly so that I don't find myself in a media bubble. Because even the smartest, most attentive, and I'm not saying I'm super smart, but I am a professor of political science, and I need to know the news. I need to know that I can trust the news that I'm seeking knowledge from, right? So anyway, I encourage you to do the same, and don't trust what pops up on your news feed without question. So the government does have a role to play in this, right? The media is not completely wide open. Airwaves are not free. The government issues licenses for radio and TV, which is important. And over time, as corporations get bigger and can buy up other corporations, we're down to basically 6 major media corporations in the United States, which isn't in and of itself a bad thing per se, but we need to be mindful of gatekeeping, which is discussed in the textbook. And this is where media outlets can, in effect, decide what we know about, right? That's a form of gatekeeping. They're the gatekeepers. They're at the gate deciding what passes through. And what passes through gets to our ears, right? And so with fewer and fewer media corporations in play, to give you just a crude example that will come up again in a few minutes, we talked earlier in the semester about how difficult it is for third parties in the United States to gain traction and win elections. And I think it's in no small part because of the fact that major media corporations, knowing that third parties aren't likely to be successful, don't really tell us much about them, right? That's a form of gatekeeping. Is that bad for democracy? It doesn't sound good, but it is the way it is, right? So that's why it's on us to find out about third parties and not just trust the media, because media, good, bad, and ugly, is biased to some extent. Now, I will not tell you, I'm not the type to just throw my hands in the air and say, all media is biased. I don't like bias. I don't like, therefore I don't like the media. So therefore I'm not going to watch the news ever, or read or listen to the news. No. Right. So there is bias, but we got to know our way around it. And we need to understand that maybe more importantly than whether or not the news source leans to the left or leans to the right, or you think that, be more mindful of commercial bias, right? Media outlets want to keep large audiences. They don't want to run people off. And to reiterate the point that I just made about gatekeeping, again, the coverage of third-party candidates come election time in this country is non-existent. That's because, the media outlets don't necessarily think that we want to know about third parties, right? So there's an effort to keep large audiences, and that's a form of media bias in their gatekeeping right there. We can also be mindful of conflicts of interest, right? As companies buy each other up, there are many companies that do other things besides the news that now own news companies. And it helps to be aware of that fact too, right? I'll give you an example as well that I will reiterate at some point soon too. PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, airs every day a show called The News Hour, which I mentioned a minute ago. It's free on YouTube. Every day you can watch it. And it's quite good, quite informative. And the public and public radio does mean that PBS gets pennies, literally, of its budget from the federal government. It's under 3%. And the rest comes from sponsors, whether that is viewers like me, as they remind me every time I watch the PBS NewsHour, or it could be from corporate sponsors, like the new company called Meta, which is corporate Facebook's new name. Facebook, the company, has long given money to PBS, and PBS is not afraid to cover Facebook, the politics of social media, pretty directly and pretty critically. But what PBS does, every time a journalist on PBS talks about Facebook, the network points out that Facebook is a donor to PBS, whether it's good or bad, the coverage good or bad. And that I appreciate and I respect, right? I don't want there to be a conflict of interest, say that some big corporation owns this media outlet and therefore the corporation dictates what the media outlet can say. And that gets back to the gatekeepers link that I posted a minute ago. So I hope I'm making sense. I'm going to move on because I feel like I'm repeating myself, but you need to be able to trust your media source and know that if there is any apparent possible conflict of interest, that your media outlet will tell you about that, right? Beyond that, we can talk about media bias. Sometimes individual journalists or media outlets will try to rush to break a story, to be the first to report it. And we could think of this as a form of bias because that's a way to get the eyes. And I'm thinking bias in terms of being willing to overlook facts and such to break a story ahead of everyone else. Because if a media outlet gets it wrong, especially if it's a major media outlet, they lose a lot of legitimacy. And so that's why too, when it comes to sensationalist media, I'm also pretty skeptical unless I trust the news source that I'm looking at. Because the fact of the matter is here, we do have a choice, right? There are lots of independent views on the internet. Some are good, most aren't worth our time. There are some startups and small media outlets. Some have evolved into rather large ones, again, like the media aggregator that is the HuffPost. NPR started about 50 years ago. I think it was 1971 that NPR started, National Public Radio. And it's still a lot smaller than other, the major news outlets that you've heard of. You've probably not ever heard of National Public Radio, but again, I recommend it. I think it's a pretty middle of the road, reliable news outlet. I don't feel like NPR is lying to me. And a good media outlet too, when a mistake is made, will fess up to it immediately to clear the air for all involved. Media funded by nonprofits. A lot of nonprofit organizations do give money to sources like National Public Radio and PBS. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, as long as, again, any sort of conflict of interest is known to everyone viewing or listening or reading the news presented. Right? That is important. So does a free press mean that there are no constraints on the media, right? The government does have a role to play here. The government is very not quick to censor any form of print media. I think that just gets back to the notion of the free press as it existed when the Constitution was signed. That's the tradition we have in this country. There's a bit more constraint on broadcast media. The FCC is the Federal Communications Commission. And this is the group, the institute that tells us all the bad words we can't say on TV, for better, for worse. Beyond that, the issue of net neutrality, I think, is an important one. And I think, as I mentioned in the slides, I want to say back in the chapter on the judiciary, this is the future of the First Amendment. Debates in this country will have to do in the coming years and decades with freedom of speech on the internet. I have no doubt that is the legal future of our country. And net neutrality itself, as you might recall, it's come up a couple of times in the text thus far. This is the notion that internet service providers can't speed up or slow down your access to any information or web pages on the internet based upon their interests, right? It could be that, say, corporate ownership of some internet company means that, let's say that the company in question, let's say hypothetically Spectrum, which is my internet provider here in San Antonio, doesn't get along well with Google, or the parent company of Google is called Alphabet, but Alphabet owns Google, Alphabet owns YouTube, and let's say Spectrum decided to slow down my access to Googling anything or YouTube to the point that I can't really watch videos, right? That would be a violation of net neutrality. The service provider is not being neutral. And again, this is something that I think companies, large internet service providers have varying interest in. And every now and again, this comes up as a hot button political issue in some circles in the United States, with many of us defending the notion of net neutrality, right? It's not like, think of it this way. Would you want a power company that will pump in enough electricity to your house to run, I don't know, your toaster, but, not your ceiling fan? I mean, it's a silly example, but, we just assume that electricity is going to flow into the house equitably and all of our things will work. So you would expect when you log on to the internet that you will have the same access to anything you want to look at on the internet, right? That's net neutrality. So, and again, I really think that the debate over net neutrality is going to be the future of political debate in the court system in this country. But let's keep thinking about government regulation here. How free should the internet be, right? Should the government be involved in, say, trying to prevent hacking of social media and manipulation? Should the government step in and insist that those at Facebook who monitor things that are posted, or pick your social media platform, have more training if the rules are similar across platforms? I don't have an answer to these questions. I don't know what they should be, but I worry that Congress is not the best institution to protect us if we need protection, if somehow, the internet, as I put it here, turns against us. This hyperlink here will take you to a very short 3-minute clip of little snippets of Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook and the leader of the Meta company, testifying before Congress, I want to say back in 2018, and just listen to some of the questions you hear from these old senators who clearly have no idea how social media works and more broadly the internet. It's worth a watch. Your jaw will hit the floor when you realize what the people we have elected to represent us in Congress do not know about just the basics of how the internet works. Right? It makes me feel like I know what I'm doing in front of a computer when I watch that. But let's shift gears away from the government, think more about what journalists do here. And if you've watched the John Oliver first clip on journalism, and I'm going to assume that you have, I'm not going to go into great detail here because he did a good job of fleshing all of this out. But good journalists do chase the news, right? They want the truth. They're interested in the truth. They're also interested in creating a coherent story, right? We know Barbour, the author of the AmGov book, has made it clear the importance of narratives throughout our daily lives, right? We want to be informed, and in many ways we're informed whether we like it or not. And having things packaged in a coherent way with a coherent story is often helpful, right? But we want to make sure that what we're being told is true, right? And that's, again, why in my 40 plus years here, I've gone out of my way really for the last 20 or so to find news sources I know I can trust. But journalists do 4 key things. They themselves are gatekeepers, like, as individuals, like their editors and parent companies are institutionally. Journalists are disseminators, right? They disseminate information, they spread information, they share information. They can be investigators or analysts, or sometimes both. Right? I wish we had better media literacy in this country to understand when we're reading an investigative piece that deals with facts and when we're dealing with a journalist's analysis, which is where, the journalist's judgment spills in to the presentation of facts, right? I hope when you read a news article on the news, or on your stupid smartphone, if you're reading something that's an opinion piece, or if it's meant to be just a presentation of facts. I'll put in another shout out for my favorite magazine, The Economist. Again, pretty conservative. I'm not necessarily, but the first section of the magazine is editorial pieces, opinion pieces, and I know this. And I don't always read every one of them, and it kind of just depends on the issue that it's dealing with. And I don't always agree with the very magazine that I've subscribed to for likely longer than you've been alive. which really disturbs me to think, because I started subscribing to this when I was still in college. I was a big nerd, but I know when I'm reading an opinion analysis, and I know in that magazine when I'm reading what's meant to be just the facts, and that's helpful. But journalists, either way, whether investigators or analysts, really try to mobilize us, right? No journalist writes something to be published to pray as they go to sleep at night. Boy, I hope nobody reads this, right? That's not what they do. So that's their goal, is to get us to react to what's been written, right? To feel more informed, to be better citizens, voters, etc., right? But there are threats to professional journalism at present, just beyond less money for print outlets, which was very much discussed in the John Oliver clip. News aggregation, he was also critical of the HuffPost, as I am. But news aggregators basically just take journalism from other sources and put it on their website, and that's not real journalism, right? The problem with this, or why this is a reality, is that most of us don't want to pay for news content, especially online. Very few of us, I highly doubt any of you watching this video pay for any news that you consume. Maybe you do, and if you do, I thank you for it. But again, I realize I'm an adult, I have a job. My wife's an engineer, so she makes more money than I do. So I can buy subscriptions to 4 different magazines, right? I can do that. Not everyone can. When it comes to online content, I do pay PBS, which I do watch online. I pay PBS about $10 a month. It's totally voluntary. And I give NPR about $10 a month, not about $10 a month, period. Because I'm willing to pay at least a little bit for the news that I receive. More broadly, in part because of the dwindling money, and this can be cyclical, a vicious cycle, if you will. As journalism is threatened by news aggregators dwindling profits, we also seem to trust the media even less, which makes it less likely that we're willing to pay for media, right? So, our journalist friends, and I don't know if anybody here, I don't know if San Antonio, if A&M San Antonio has a journalism program or not, but my guess is fewer and fewer people are actually studying journalism today, and that makes me sad. But moving on here with what journalists do, good journalists, again, don't write fake news. Fake news is really just a term that gets thrown around, which is another way of saying, I don't like this news, right? It's meant to discredit the source, and it's often the person making the fake news claim that is, in effect, discrediting themselves. But it's about, again, controlling the narrative. And that's, again, a theme that runs through the book, right? If you can just discredit news that you find detrimental to your cause, that's an attempt to control the narrative, right? But good journalism, we've talked about it here. It's about getting the details. It's about making sure they're true. It's about disseminating that information to as many people as possible. And there is evidence of a bit of a rebirth in journalism, not so much in the traditional sense of the local newspaper, whether you grew up in tiny town in West Texas or Dallas or Boise, Idaho, or I don't care. Local journalism, I think, is really what is threatened the most by what we've been discussing, but it doesn't mean that there aren't good investigative journalists out there telling us, if we care to listen, about what's going on around us. And to that end, we seem to really want a story, right? I mean, I warn us against falling prey to narratives that aren't true, but I agree with Barbour. I mean, narratives help us digest what we see, what we observe, what we understand. And again, to repeat myself, ideally, we should seek fact-based narratives, right? We need to find sources, news sources that we trust, journalists that we trust. And it could be that the identity of the storyteller themselves is important to you, right? I don't want to get all my news from old fuddy-duddy white guys. Like, I don't want the same old fuddy-duddy white guys in Congress, legislating how the internet works. But who tells the story can also be important. What matters to me is that the story is true. and the facts are straight and presented as such. I'm also leery of the revolving door, right? We've talked about the revolving door before, say about people working in government and then working as lobbyists and then going back to government, maybe back to being lobbyists. The same thing happens with the media. There are those who work in government and then become journalists, or start as journalists and then get into government and then go back to journalism. And that can create conflicts of interest, just as it did with politicians and lobbyists, right? So I do like to know when the person I'm viewing, listening to, watching, reading, I want to know if that person has worked in government. At this point with the national media, I, being me, Larson here, tends to know, recognize the name and such, but not always. But again, like with the conflicts of interest with corporate funding, I just want to know. And then I can make a decision if I want to trust what I'm hearing or not, right? Because the media, in that shaping of narratives, has some tools that can be used to great effect, right? Agenda setting is a term that came up, and it's a good one. It has a lot to do with gatekeeping, right? Media outlets can, in effect, decide for us what's important and what becomes the news and ends up on the political agenda. This is a reality that we can't deny. Once that happens, then media outlets can then frame the news, which is how they tell us what's important and what we should pay attention to. Right now, if you're having your agenda set and issues framed by a news source that deals with more opinion than fact, well, then you're less likely to know what's going on in reality, right? And mix into this equation is this whole new job, for lack of a better term, of professional communication, professional communicators. And I'm not talking about journalists necessarily. I'm talking about people who work for politicians and run their media communications, right? Which just can entrench these easy narratives that might not necessarily be true. I'll give you a quick example in as short amount of time as I can without leaving out big details. I realize you were likely a child in 2003, but after September 11th, 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan. The purpose was to get back for 9/11, to find Osama bin Laden, who had been based in Afghanistan under the protection of the prior government there. By 2003, the Bush administration decided that we needed to think about Iraq. And even before 2003, it started as early as 2001, late 2001. And the professional political communicators got on board, and then the media jumped on board too. And all of a sudden, the agenda was set, and Iraq was a threat. And then the framing set in, and we were primed to then endorse the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, because the dictator of Iraq at the time, Saddam Hussein, was alleged to have weapons of mass destruction that he was going to give to terrorists who were going to use against us. And it turned out that really not much of that was true. But even the New York Times, which is viewed by many, including the former U.S. president, as the most liberally biased newspaper on the face of the earth, bought it and sold it. And so, even professional journalists can fall prey to an easy narrative, and it can have real consequences for millions of people around the globe when we don't ask questions, right? When we don't, or if and when we fall victim to spin, as it's called, right? We want to stay unspun, as I say here. So we should avoid these things: feeding frenzies, horse race journalism, and sound bites, right? Feeding frenzies occur when, say, I don't mean to be crude or crass like John Oliver, but oftentimes when there's an SEX scandal, a politician, it's not always politicians. Other people do dumb things too, but it happens once a year, it seems. Maybe not of late because of the virus, but that a politician, usually a him, finds himself in the company of a woman that's not his spouse. And that can usually cause a stir in the media. And that's what we mean by feeding frenzy, where journalists from all different outlets focus on one story that really is more salacious than useful. I do remember a handful of years ago, the former governor, I believe his name was Mark Sanford of South Carolina, claimed to be taking some time off and hiking the Appalachian Trail on his own. And it was later revealed by good journalism that he was actually in Argentina with his lover. And as you can imagine, the conservative voters of South Carolina did not appreciate this. But it turned into a media feeding frenzy for 2 or 3 days. It was just all I heard about, hiking the Appalachian Trail. And this has been over a decade ago. But I think the ultimate feeding frenzy was probably the Clinton affair, literally affair, in the late 90s. And I was probably about your age and not completely paying attention to everything like I could have or should have. But as I'm watching the American Crime Story show, on impeachment that's out now with my wife, who's not a U.S. citizen and wasn't living in the States in the 90s. And we were talking about this, and it was a total feeding frenzy for months about Clinton and the affair with the intern Monica Lewinsky. But this can also translate in the longer term to what we call horse race journalism, term by which we mean journalists racing to catch the story and publish it to be the first. And competition is a good thing. That's how capitalism works, right? That's why we have iPhones and such. Competition breeds a better product, so we think. But sometimes with journalism, if reporters aren't clear with the facts, then you could win a horse race and then get disqualified when what you report isn't true. And we're all victims of sound bites. Politicians are quite good at giving us prepackaged just one-liners that are meant to illuminate reality for us. I would ask that you, as a thinking person, be weary of sound bites, of just the one-liners that are meant to make sense and usually don't reflect the complexity of the reality around us. But we do need to understand that politicians are important players in the media. Politicians don't report the news, but they make the news, right? And politicians can often find themselves in conflict with the media, right? Because we need the media. And again, I'll go back to the notion of local print journalism. And that was the story that was conveyed in the first John Oliver clip that I showed you. But, the media is not always kind to politicians, and politicians aren't always kind to the media. The media is there for us. And this is why the founding fathers wanted there to be a free press. They wanted the media to tell us what's going on and to tell us when politicians don't play by the rules, right? But politicians increasingly are just as, well, maybe not the old ones in the Senate who you saw questioning Mark Zuckerberg, but their staff has access to technology, right? And so they can fight back. Bad stories come out, they can go to Twitter and they can go to the social media outlets to try to respin the story, to try to change the narrative, right? And the fact of the matter is, as a consequence of this abundance of information, the presence of media, constant presence of media, this has really then turned into the era of permanent campaign for politicians, right? Especially in the House of Representatives, because we know that everyone in the House serves a 2-year term. So you're constantly running for re-election. This is less the case in the Senate, where senators, of course, serve for 6 years, and maybe a little less so for the president. But after the midterms, 2 years into any president's term, it feels like the next presidential campaign has kicked off, and it's 2 years of the same crap. I say this, I follow it, but I get news fatigue sometimes. But anyway. What politicians do vis-a-vis the media is not super new, right? We can trace this back to Nixon, President Nixon, who was elected in 1968 and reelected in 72 and then resigned in 74. He's responsible for a lot of major changes in how we do things. I don't think it's because of him. It's because he was president at that time. As media outlets were growing, as technology was as well in the United States as far back as the 1960s, Nixon realized, and his team realized, that they needed to keep tight control of information. They needed to control access to Nixon himself. And in doing so, or knowing this, the Nixon team created an elaborate communications bureaucracy that all presidents have used in different ways up to today, right? So, you know, the White House always has what we call the press corps, CORPS, like the Marine Corps. Corps is a fancy word for body or institution, right? So there are always journalists at the White House. There are those who, you know, maybe show up every day from 8 to 5. There are those from all the major news sources who are probably on site 24 hours a day. And they're there to get information from the source, from the president's office, right? But Nixon and President since have sought to go around the White House press corps as possible, whether that's through prepackaging the news into sound bites, or whether that's leaking information secretively to, say, one particular journalist who then reports the news as exactly the administration wants it reported. Journalists, the selected journalist who gets the information tends to love it. Everyone else tends to not. Sometimes leaks can be very important to let us know what's really going on, and sometimes they're meant to mislead. But other presidents since, and this is not the complete list of presidents since Nixon, but these are 4 presidents, and then the 5th being Trump, that Barbour talks about to some length in this chapter 9 here. But Reagan, remember, was an actor and governor of California before becoming president. He was very good and charismatic in his feeding the beast, which is to say dealing with the Washington press corps. Bill Clinton, pretty slimy character, but also pretty charismatic and good at dealing with the media. But as Barbour points out, having been governor of Arkansas, a much smaller state with a much less overwhelming media, with much less of a national presence, he had to go through a bit of an adjustment from Arkansas to Washington, D.C. when he became president. George W. Bush, fellow Texan, was a bit endearing, but not nearly as charismatic as Reagan or Clinton or Obama, for that matter. And he tried to stay a bit at arm's length from the media himself, but he had a good team of talkers who would communicate with the media directly. Obama was a pretty gifted public speaker, but he was also, probably of all the presidents I've mentioned, the most critical of leaks. Right. The Obama administration kept a very tight ship and did not leak information willy-nilly to the press. The Trump rules changed the equation a little bit. As Barbour points out in her chapter here, difficult to characterize. Again, while Barbour, early on in the book, I thought maybe she might be a Republican, to claim as matter of factly she does that Trump press secretaries would lie to the public. I mean, they all do to some extent, but to put it that bluntly, as Barbour did, is, I guess, impressive in a way on her part. But, knowing that press secretaries were not telling the truth was frustrating to many while Trump was president. Trump himself would go over the head of his communications team and communicate directly with the public via Twitter, which, from what I understand, his team often did not like, and there were constant leaks coming out of the Trump White House. I have a couple of hyperlinks here. The first one on alternative facts is only about 3 minutes long, but it is a quick exchange that was on a Sunday morning show called Meet the Press that Larson loves. And this was shortly after Trump's inauguration in January 2017, in which the journalist Chuck Todd of NBC asked a spokesperson for the Trump administration why the press secretary claimed that Trump's inauguration was the best attended in the history of the country. And she didn't like the question, and she accused, or she stated that the press secretary was using alternative facts in his characterization of the attendance of Trump's inauguration. As you can imagine, that was laughed at by many at the time, and then translated into satire on Saturday Night Live, which is that second link there, which is a spoof on the press secretary's first interaction with the press corps. It will make you laugh. Melissa McCarthy is dressed up as a man named Sean Spicer, who did not take very well to her characterization, her satirization of Mr. Spicer. But anyway, the Trump rules, very quickly, here's this, I'm about done. And Trump's interacting with the press. It seems, according to Barbour, and I don't disagree, that he deliberately was out to make some people hate him, knowing that enough people would really eat up what he was presenting via the media, or what he presented via the media. We all know that any president exploits crisis to their own end. That's Democrats do it, Republicans do it. But Trump definitely did, to the point that sometimes it almost felt like the crisis of the day might have been created by the White House itself. But what Trump was very good at doing is repeating the narrative, right? And in doing so, enough people are going to believe it, right? Whether it's true or not, it didn't seem to matter. And that was, again, Trump's appealing to the base of the party more so than the middle of the road voter. And that's something we've talked about in recent weeks too. But when it came to the people working for Trump, he definitely seemed to keep them in line and competitive for his favor. He often favored loyalty over skill. Hardly anyone while working for Trump, or Trump himself, of course, would ever admit that they were wrong, which again is something that journalists should be the first person to do if and when they are publicly mistaken. But how Trump interacted with the press was a bit different than pretty much everybody going back to Nixon. And before Nixon, there wasn't a whole lot of interaction with the media to discuss. But anyway, what can we do here, right? We need to reclaim the narrative as citizens, right? We need to understand, again, that we're vulnerable to manipulation. We need to understand that, the flip side of the media saturation is that there's increased potential for any of us and all of us to have a voice, which, again, before social media came about, before the internet, that's when gatekeepers did their best gatekeeping, right? But now it's even possible for non-journalists, for regular citizens to find out something's wrong and release the information, right? We need to understand, though, when we think about the major news sources, the implications and of ethics, of conflicts of interest. Again, I want to know when a for-profit media company has an economic interest in what they're reporting, or when a non-for-profit news organization receives donations from whatever business, institute, other organization. And I want to make the decision as to whether I can trust that news source or not, right? But there we go. That's what we need to do as individuals. And then finally, again, settle on some trustworthy sources of news and analysis. The final two links here, I guarantee you will make you laugh. I'm not going to click on them now. You can do it on your own, as I realize I'm about to 50 minutes and I'll shut up. This is my last slide, but the blue news here will take you to a short, I don't know, it's maybe 5-minute clip of me talking on the local news in Northern California, the Redwood News on Super Tuesday in March of 2020, right before the pandemic really took off in this country. But I'm talking about the presidential primaries and Sanders versus Biden in the California primaries. You might find it informative. See me on the news. I had no idea where to look. The cameraman was very annoyed with me. You don't see him because he's off camera, but you see me clearly not knowing what the hell I'm doing. I'm knowing about the politics, but not knowing about how to be on camera. And then the analysis section here takes you to the first time I was ever on TV news back in Spain. I mistakenly wore an outfit that matched the set. If you're ever on TV, if it's planned, watch the show before you're on it so you don't show up wearing clothes that makes you look like a damn chameleon. But I did that. And I did not know beforehand that the journalists were going to be speaking to me. Were going to speak to me in Galician, which is a language spoken in northwestern Spain. It's kind of very similar to Spanish and Portuguese mixed together. I understand it pretty well. I respond in Spanish, but yeah, I didn't know what language they were going to speak to me in. And that made it more fun. And that helps to explain the fear on my face that you will see if you click and watch that link. But anyway, there we go. That's Larson's take on the media. I'm in it under 50 minutes. Take care. Get in touch if you have any questions on the exam that you need to take by the end of the weekend. All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Here we go.